Well, good afternoon and welcome to Full Scottish. It's Sunday the 28th of August and I'm Hugh Stewart. Now today for the next hour with the company of Alan Brown, Member of Parliament, and the journalist and author Ian Fraser, we're going to be looking at some of the top stories which have emerged over the last week. So in a couple of minutes, we're going to be looking first of all about revelations of potential criminal behaviour by ex-President Donald Trump. So we'll look at that. And then we're going to look at the economy. We're going to be looking at the energy crisis, the cost of living crisis, and also at the GERS figures, the Scottish income and expenditure figures, which were released that last week. So we're going to be looking at those and a couple of other stories with our two guests. But first of all, I'm going to go over the latest we have heard from Russia's attack in Ukraine on day 186. Firstly, concern about the potential for a nuclear radiation leak at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant persists. Ukraine's state energy operator has warned that there are risks of hydrogen leakage and spluttering of radioactive substances at the Russian-occupied plant. Authorities were distributing iodine tablets to residents who live near the plant in case of radiation exposure. Russia and Ukraine have traded fresh accusations with each other of accusing each other of shelling the area around Europe's largest nuclear plant. The International Atomic Energy Agency is trying to negotiate access to the plant for an urgent inspection mission to, as they put it, to help stabilise the nuclear plant and the security situation there. Russia-backed militias may have made progress towards the centre of Pitsky village, which is near Donetsk airport, but Russian forces overall have secured few territorial gains, according to the latest report from the UK Ministry of Defence. Russia's blocked an agreement at the UN aimed at bolstering the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. The failure to agree to a joint statement due to Moscow's objection to a clause about control over Zaporizhzhia is the latest blow to hopes of maintaining an arms control regime and keeping a lid on the rekindled arms race. Ukrainian soldiers of draft age who are employed as crew members will be allowed to leave the country for work, Ukraine's cabinet of ministers has said. The UK Ministry of Defence has said it's giving 6 underwater drones to Ukraine to help clear its coastline of mines to make the grain shipments safer. And Kazakhstan, a neighbour and ally of Russia, has suspended all arms exports for a year, its government said, amid the conflict in Ukraine and Western sanctions against Moscow. And finally, Poland and the Czech Republic have agreed to protect the airspace of their NATO ally Slovakia as it upgrades its air force from legacy Soviet-made MiG-29 fighters to a new batch of F-16 jets made in the United States. So that's the latest. Gentlemen, before we move on, have you any comments on the Ukraine situation just over 6 months into the war? Alan Brown, let's ask you, and can you hear me all right?
I can hear you, yeah. I mean, I think we've got to commend Ukraine for the resilience. You know, obviously, initially, it was tipped that Kiev would be taken quite quickly. So 6 months on, a real testament, as I say, to the resilience of the Ukrainian nation in whole, as well as obviously the armed forces in Ukraine. But I think for me, that the big concern at the moment is this about the nuclear power plant. It actually shows the risk of nuclear power in terms of, it can be used in terms of terrorism and as a threat, and it's a real concern that the Russian attitude towards managing this plant and to use it as a weapon effectively. We all know, the fallout from Chernobyl previously. Radiation is not just a local thing. If there's a leak, then affects a wide area for sure. So that's my main concern at the moment.
Yes, so that's Alan Brown, thank you, who's the Member of Parliament for Kilmarnock and Loudon, joining us from just outside Kilmarnock. And same question to Ian Fraser, who's joining us from Midlothian. Good afternoon, Ian. So 6 months on, this doesn't look like it's going to be over. We'll still be talking about this next year, but the way it looks. Can you see any possible endgame? Russia cannot be seen to be defeated. That will surely mean the end of the Russian regime. But at the same time, the Ukrainians are not interested in compromise, are they? They want Russia out of everything. They want Russia out of every part of Ukraine, including Crimea. Can you see any possibility of a negotiated settlement?
sadly, at the moment, the chance of a negotiated settlement seem minimal, and neither side is prepared to compromise. Russia has recently confirmed it's not going to enter any peace talks, and Ukraine, as far as I'm aware, wants to get Russia out of every single square meter of Ukraine. Sorry, yeah, he wants to get Russia out of every single square meter of Ukraine. So it's looking like this could become a very long and drawn out conflict. Could well go on for many years, which is depressing because it's just an awful situation, and neither side seems to be willing to compromise anything at the moment.
Yep, so I'm afraid, sadly, at day 186 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and certainly looks like there's going to be a lot more of them. So let's move over to our top story for today. We've been hearing over the last couple of days about moves by the American Attorney General against former President Donald Trump. Now, this arises because of the FBI, as Donald Trump called it, break into his home in Mar-a-Lago. Of course, FBI officers visited his home with a search warrant and removed many documents. And the nature of these documents is really potentially criminal, because it turns out that when Donald Trump left office, which is over a year and a half ago, of course, he took a lot of documents with him out of the White House. Now, we don't know why he did this, but the documents are, in fact, there's possibly a couple of hundred of them. Some of them are labelled secret, some of them are labelled confidential, some are labelled top secret. I think there's something like 25 are top secrets. And by convention, these should not be removed anywhere. But if they are taken away, they should at least be kept under lock and key. So the evidence, which we just heard yesterday, is that Donald Trump not only removed them from the White House, but also was extremely lax in security. Now, let's go to Ian Fraser on this. Have you heard of any precedent of a previous president having classified confidential information in his house?
I'm unaware of any occasion when a past president has removed top secret or confidential documents from the White House on demitting office. It is an extraordinary set of circumstances, and you wonder what on earth Donald Trump was thinking of when he did remove these documents. They are obviously potentially a security risk, because if they contain information about America's nuclear program or other state secrets, and he has got Chinese nationals infiltrating Mar-a-Lago under false pretenses, which I believe has already happened. Then you do potentially have the situation of foreign powers getting hold of information which they wouldn't otherwise have access to. I cannot think of any previous U.S. president who would have removed this quantity, or in fact any confidential top secret documents from the White House on leaving the White House. So one wonders what Trump's game plan is. You do also wonder perhaps whether this is great for Trump's opponents, who obviously don't want him to be able to stand for president next time, and if he can have committed a serious breach of the Espionage Act, which is along the same lines of what Snowden is alleged to have done, then obviously he can't stand. I'd imagine he would be ruled out from standing for US president again.
Yes, Alan, the issue behind this, of course, is the upcoming midterm elections for Congress and Senate, which are in November. So I gather as a deadline, looking at the American press, the Attorney General would have to decide really in the next week whether to prosecute former President Trump over these security breaches. So do you think this would rule Trump out from potentially standing again in 24 if he's actually indicted for serious security offences?
I mean, I think he was indicted, it rules him out, but unfortunately with Trump, no rules seem to exist for him. So, we know how he tried to resist leaving the White House, and obviously we talked about fake election, fake results and all that. So it would need to be legally watertight to stop him standing. Otherwise, he's just going to continue with the conspiracy theories and, obviously say it's establishment out to get him. I think what surprised me is, actually some of the senior Republicans, like Mike Pence, actually also spoke out against the FBI raiding Mar-a-Lago. So, the fact that senior Republicans are almost saying that this shouldn't have happened, instead of actually speaking out and questioning why did Trump have these documents. It's actually, I was thinking about it earlier on, that Trump was renowned for not actually paying attention to detail, for not paying attention to briefings and not reading papers. So it's therefore even more mind-boggling that he's actually taken papers away from the White House and stored them in, stored them unsecurely. His rationale is it's unfathomable, to be honest.
Yes, I'm just wondering, we're just speculating here though, but of course, Donald Trump's attitude always, since he lost the presidential race, has of course been that he didn't lose. He claims it was stolen from him. And so you mentioned the conspiracy idea. He, in fact, used the phrase break-in to the seizure of these documents under a legal search warrant. So do you think it's possibly that he felt that he would be moving back into the White House quite soon? So is that his mindset, that he's not really lost, and so he can keep state documents if he wants to, because he's really the president? Do you think that's what's going on in his head?
I wouldn't like to speculate what's going on in Donald Trump's head, to be honest. I really can't get my head round why he'd have these documents. But even then, if he thought he was going to be president again, there's no reason for holding on to classified documents. It serves no purpose. If he's going to be president again, he would be able to reaccess the documents he requires. So it makes no sense to be holding on to them in a private resort.
And yes, as you mentioned, Ian earlier on, you were talking about a Chinese citizen infiltrating the Trump camp. So there was also in the American press, I read that a Ukrainian who posed as a socialite has also been in the Trump camp, and I think she'd been playing golf with Trump. So he really seems to take a very lax attitude to security. So maybe he's one of the last people who should have top security documents in his possession. Have you heard anything more about that Ukrainian person who claimed to be somebody else?
I heard she was pretending to be a member of the Rothschild banking dynasty when she got into the Mar-a-Lago private members club. It's only recently emerged, I think it emerged on Friday, that this Ukrainian woman who's in her early 30s had breached security, as I said, posing as a member of the Rothschild banking dynasty and getting into the Mar-a-Lago resort. I didn't know she'd actually played golf with Trump, though. I didn't know that bit.
You better not quote me on that. Maybe that was the other one. But it certainly there's a couple of times that people have certainly infiltrated Mar-a-Lago. So security seems to be quite lax there for the guy who thinks he's going to, well, I don't know, he's either going to be running for president again or he's often been described as a kingmaker. Alan, do you think this would tend to work against the Republicans as they're looking forward to the November elections? Surely Republicans, or Conservatives usually, in most countries, stand on the law and order ticket. So if their previous leader is even suggested to be guilty of very serious criminal behaviour, surely that's going to count against the Republicans in the election. How do you think that would play?
You'd expect it to count against the Republicans. I mean, I think your more moderate Republicans certainly you'd imagine would take a dim view of this, but clearly Trump has built up a core base support, and that core base support seem to be behind him whatever happens, and they'll certainly buy into the conspiracy theory. But certainly when it comes to swing voters, you would expect them, as I say, to take a dim view. And you say you can't preach about law and order when you're absolutely breaking it yourself. And we know obviously the investigation's ongoing as well in terms of the events at the White House and the storming the White House and Trump's role and all that. So that I suspect that will resurface during the midterm elections as well.
Yeah, looking back to the Trump-Clinton campaign a few years ago, of course, Trump's very telling, powerful attack on Clinton was that Hillary Clinton, was using private emails, which could have caused security leaks. In fact, one of his big slogans at his rallies was "Jail Crooked Hillary," wasn't it? So he, in fact, used this argument against Clinton that she was lax in security. So, Ian, do you think that you think people are going to be remembering that again when it comes up to November midterms?
It's possible, but I think the hardline Republican Trump supporters, the MAGA crowd, they will definitely just see this as a kind of Democrat stroke left wing led conspiracy against their superhero. So they see the world in probably in a different way to most other people, and I was going to raise Edward Snowden again. He is a hero because for many people, because he exposed abuses by the NSA and other security agencies of personal data via social media and via IT, and he's been charged under the Surveillance Act as well. So it's quite interesting, even though he has been charged, it doesn't actually make people think less of him in terms of what he exposed. So perhaps likewise with a MAGA hardline Trump supporter, they won't think the less of Trump even if he is charged or indicted on a breach of the Espionage Act.
So we will see what happens in the next couple of days. The Attorney General has to decide whether to prosecute, but various newspapers and CNN in America have been saying that the evidence quite clear. And incidentally, just before we move on, the evidence comes from a publicised affidavit. It looks like the Trump camp demanded that the authorities hand over the evidence they've got on them. In fact, Trump's camp demanded that the Attorney General let the people see what they've got on him, and that turns out to have been quite a lot. So he shot himself in the foot. Do you think so, Alan? If you heard about this, he actually said, let the people see what they're accusing me of, and now that's come out, and this is what he's being accused of making off with these security documents. So again, does Trump maybe just, does he think he's bulletproof?
I mean, that's right. It's that bluster, isn't it? The Trump bluster, I'll shout loudly, I'll deny it, challenge the authorities, and then when the proof comes, he goes into further denial mode. It's a crazy way to operate, but obviously in his mind it worked for him because he became president. And as we said earlier on, he's in denial about losing the election, so he'll continue to do anything he can to promote himself, to defend himself, and try to manoeuvre his way back into power.
I actually quite like your theory, Hugh. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I like your theory that given he still thinks he is the president and he thinks that the 2020 election was stolen, maybe he just thinks that he's entitled to do whatever he wants with White House property.
Well, that would kind of make sense to me anyway. That who was it said that if you want to lie to people, you have to believe it yourself? Actually, I think I'm quoting Better Call Saul there. But anyway, let's move on to our next story. We are going to return to the stories about the press and political bias potentially in our final story today, because we're going to look at Emily Maitlis's attack on the BBC. But before that, we're going to look at the economy. Now, let's move on to the issue everyone's talking about just now in the UK, particularly, which has especially severe increases coming up in the gas and electricity prices, of course, as people I'm sure know by now. Last Friday, the energy regulator, Ofgem, allowed gas and energy bills to increase by another 80%. And that's, of course, on top of big increases that happened earlier this year. So the story we had on Friday is an average household bill will rise to £3,500 unless the new Prime Minister does something to mitigate it in a week's time. So let's, first of all, Alan, let's turn to the question of why the government hasn't done anything about it up to now. As I said, the energy prices have already been rising throughout this year, and everyone knew that the cap was going to be lifted last Friday. But the government throughout this term seems to have been on holiday, particularly for the last month. And this is August bank holiday. Is this not the time for bad news to happen because the government's not in?
Well, you could say that, but I mean, you're right to say the government's been missing action for a long time. I mean, we know the Tories are distracted with the leadership contest, so in many ways it's been convenient for many of the ministers not to be under pressure to do anything. But think you'll be aware the SNP's been calling for a few weeks now to have Parliament recalled. So that's the reality. We should be in Westminster debating what the correct solutions are going forward and trying to come up with a package that actually puts people's minds at ease, because let's not be kidded, many people are worried about what this potential increase could mean for them and for their families.
Yes, Ian, the increases that we've seen already, which are of course going to come in October, so they haven't happened yet. The 80% increase is going to come in. It's going to be huge, isn't it? It's going to be devastating. Again, if the government and the new government taking over a week tomorrow doesn't do anything drastic, thousands of businesses are going to have to close, aren't they? We've heard this week people like bakers and chip fryers, people who use a lot of electricity, they're going to see their bills going from about $3,000 a month to $12,000 a month. Businesses are just simply going to close, aren't they?
Businesses do not have a cap on their electricity bills, unlike households. So yeah, this could theoretically force the closure of up to 1/4 of UK SMEs, which would obviously be disastrous from an economic perspective and an employment perspective. We think high streets are kind of suffering at the moment, but if you can imagine that at least 1 in 4 of those shops and or other businesses is going to close because they can't afford to pay their energy bills, it's worrying. In terms of we're seeing a rise from, I think, £1,971, which is the current cap per year, to nearly 3,600 from the 1st of October. That expires at the end of December, and there are forecasts that annual bills could rise in April to as much as £6,500 per year. And even for pretty well-off people, that is going to be a huge financial shock, which less well-off people, single people on universal credit, pensioners on state pensions, families with 2 kids on universal credit, etc., are actually not going to be able to afford. They're not going to heat their homes or use their electrical appliances. And I think it was the Roundtree Foundation was saying last week that energy is going to become a luxury. Having the lights on is going to become a luxury. Having the heating on is going to become a luxury. And it's really, really worrying. And we have this hands-off, laissez-faire Tory government who has caused this crisis by their negligence of the system over the past 12 years, and their flawed assumptions regarding energy markets over the past 12 years, who are to some extent to blame for this. But now they're, I guess, in character, they're not doing nearly as much as some European countries are doing in terms of trying to alleviate the crisis for small businesses and for households.
Now, in a couple of minutes, I'd like to turn to the question of the privatised energy market. So before we look at how the energy market works in Britain and why the increases seem to be higher here than they are in other countries, I'd like to ask Alan Brown about the politics of it. So as I said before, the UK government, of course, has been missing in action, as you put it, and the fact the Prime Minister has been on holiday, I think twice, since he announced that he was going to stay in charge. But the other issue I wanted to look at is the political reaction. Now, clearly in Scotland, the First Minister has called for, first of all, emergency measures along the lines of what happened when Rishi Sunak brought in the furlough scheme, so that kind of spending of a lot of government money for an emergency. And on the other hand, the First Minister has also called for a look at the energy market, for a redesigning of the market. But that comes later on. But what's everybody else doing? I can't see personally why we don't have protests on the streets, because if you listen to what Ian just said a minute ago, the scale of that kind of closure of 1/4 of small businesses is an absolute catastrophe. I've never seen anything like that in my lifetime. So why isn't there more noise coming from the opposition in Westminster? Are they on holiday too?
Well, we know Keir Starmer obviously got back to stick for being on holiday at the wrong time as well. There's no doubt the main opposition at Westminster has been behind the curve in this. And in many ways, Labour's been too busy trying to appeal to that what they see as the Tory swing voter. And I think that's part of the wider problem of Westminster politics. For a long time, Labour's been complaining about the Tories increasing taxes and So by default, that's demanding tax cuts, are saying, tax increases are always a bad thing. Now, Labour should be arguing, and what I always argue is tax increases that are done in a fair and equitable way is the correct way to rebalance the economy. Obviously, people that can afford to pay more tax should pay more tax, and that's one of the ways that we need to rebalance the economy going forward. So, by Labour, consistently for a couple of years now complaining about tax increases, it's actually encourages the Tories to go to tax cuts. We know that's one of Liz Truss's big promises is immediate tax cuts when she comes in, which is completely the wrong priority, and there's no way it's going to address this impending crisis. Now, we know she's done a slight U-turn in talking about there will be a package, but it's quite clear she doesn't understand the gravity of the situation and what's really required going forward.
Yeah, I quoted earlier on Ian McWhirter, who's in the Herald this weekend, saying that if you're expecting any relief from Truss, forget it, because he's saying this woman is not, well, she's a super Thatcherite. She's saying you might think that the kind of tax cutting things she's saying is just to secure her election, because she's only talking to the Conservative Party at the moment. But he says, don't be under any illusion. She actually means it. She is a tax cutter. She is a low intervention, let the market sort itself out kind of politician. So, Ian Fraser, can you see any serious furlough style pumping in of money from the government when, as we expect, Prime Minister Truss takes over a week tomorrow?
I think Liz Truss is going to be a really catastrophic Prime Minister if she does become it. I think the answers that she's proposed to this cost of living crisis stroke energy crisis are just very, very inappropriate and will actually make inflation worse. She wants to, as you say, cut taxes. She wants to reintroduce fracking, and she wants to remove suspend the green levy on energy bills. These are actually anything to, and they are likely to basically put inflation even higher. Citigroup is estimating inflation will reach 18% in 2023 next year. The Bank of England is forecasting at least 13% inflation next year. And were Liz Truss to pursue the policies she's proposing, particularly the tax cuts, it would definitely go even higher than that. So, I think she's a very flawed individual. I think she's very ideologically driven. I think she's basically the puppet of what I call Tufton, which is a group of think tanks, which are right, libertarian think tanks, all based in a particular area of London, like the Institute for Economic Affairs, like the Taxpayers Alliance, and other ones along those lines. And they're rubbing their hands with glee. If they can get her in, then they're going to have their kind of nirvana, which is basically small government, low tax, Singapore-style regime. What they think, and it would be dystopia for everyone else. So yeah, I'm deeply concerned about Liz Truss getting into power. She's blinkered, and almost everything she promises is to either please her Tufton Street backers or to please a very narrow of about 150,000 members of the Tory party, who are all, as far as economically brain dead.
So basically, you're agreeing with what was suggested earlier on, that a Truss government will be like a Thatcherite government on steroids, right? Alan, is that how you look at it as well? Then a Truss government is going to do the opposite of what's needed in this emergency?
It's certainly the pitch he's making, and I agree with what Ian's saying. And I actually don't think, well, I know Liz Truss doesn't even understand how our energy bills are made up. So she spoke about removing the green levy. So that right away, that's a play to that right wing element of the Tories. Previously, they used to talk about green levies made up 23% of our electricity bills. It actually wasn't just the green levy. There's a lot of policy costs actually are incorporated, and as levies. So there's also things like the One Home Discount Scheme that's funded through a levy on our electricity bills. What's called the Eco Scheme, which actually funds energy efficiency installation, is paid through a levy on our electricity bills. So there's actually policies there that are supporting people, are helping mitigate fuel poverty for people that are a levy. And she I suspect, thinks that's all part of a green levy, which is incorrect. But also, when they're quoting the 23% figure previously, that's when our electricity bills were much smaller in value. So that actual percentage now is reduced dramatically as a make-up of our electricity bills. So actually removing that in itself doesn't dramatically reduce the household bills. It won't make that much difference to the what's called average cap or average price that's getting quoted at £3,500. So you can take that, you can take the levies away, but actually if you take them away, how does these programmes get funded? You need to move them into general taxation, which therefore is the polar opposite of a tax cut. So what Liz Truss is talking about, truthfully, she doesn't understand.
Right, so again, going into detail, you find that policy is not going to be effective anyway. So I was going to turn, before we move on to the next story, to the, why is this crisis in Britain apparently worse than it is in other countries? I believe Ian's correct in saying, I have had a look just the other day at energy price caps in Spain and France, for example, and Ireland, where prices are going up, but nowhere near as much as 80% in the UK. Ian, have you got any comment on that? Although we know, of course, because of the war we started talking about today, the gas prices are going up. But why are they having a worse effect in Britain when Britain actually doesn't use a great deal of Russian gas?
I know we were only using 4%, but we're now down to 0%, and yet our prices are going up by at least 80%. I mean, I think there've been a series of flawed assumptions and complacency from the British government, especially since about 2010, 2012. I won't list all the errors, but one of them was the assumption that natural gas, liquid natural gas, which is the imported type, which comes in these big ships with the domes on them, that would remain plentiful. That was obviously wrong. We didn't. I think it was in 2013 that Michael Fallon, who was the then energy minister, announced there would be no more subsidies for new gas storage sites. And so immediately Centrica, which owned the Rough storage site in the North Sea, decided to close it. And we have the capacity to store 2%. The UK as a country only has the capacity to store 2% of our annual gas demand, whereas most European countries have the capacity to store around 20 to 40% of their annual gas demand. So that means they're able to buy it when it's cheap and store it and ride out, spikes in the price. And they also hedge better because it's done on a government basis rather than by individual companies. The way we privatized our energy system in the late 80s and early 90s was deeply flawed, because it was all to do with short-term trading of energy markets by individual small companies, many of which got snapped up by overseas nationalized players. And there was no overall strategy. The overall energy strategy was lacking. So we've left ourselves in a more vulnerable position. It doesn't help, of course, that we just had this interconnector built between Norway and the UK, but now Norway's reservoirs are so dry they're not exporting any electricity through that interconnector. So there's been a series of flawed assumptions, a series of potentially bad luck. But the flawed assumptions include LNG would remain plentiful, the short-term market and trading would resolve shortages of supply, and that scrapping subsidies for onshore wind and for solar, which is what David Cameron's government did in 2013 to 2015 as part of his so-called cutting the green crap initiative, would benefit energy markets. Of course, it hasn't. So yeah, I think the coalition government and the government of the post-coalition government 2015 onwards has made a number of missteps which have made the situation worse.
Okay, so Alan, lack of strategic planning and, as Ian said, storage is an issue throughout Europe, of course. The big rush is to get as much gas into storage as possible to keep them through the winter and trying to avoid being blackmailed by Putin. But Britain's got almost no storage, as Ian said. The other issue there is how about privatisation in the long run? As I said, obviously there has to be an immediate help now, and well, that's maybe going to come, maybe not. But in the long run, do we need to look at renationalising the energy market?
As Nicola Sturgeon said, I mean, nothing should go off the table. I mean, instinctively, you think having these assets owned by the country would be better. So instinctively, a nationalised company think, where they're not profit driven, and any money that's made, say in the markets, gets returned and reinvested. That obviously is very appealing. The one concern that you've got to put on the table is that to renationalise, that means you've got to buy out these private companies. So you're actually you have to borrow a lot of money to be able to do that. So it is now the right time to do that. It becomes, there's pros and cons to that. But I think having a national energy company in the long run that actually is generating electricity, that's certainly something I think you've got to look at as we go forward. As Ian said, I mean, this is strategic failure. He rightly highlighted like David Cameron cutting the green crop. So we lost out in effectively 6 years of onshore wind development, 6 years of solar development. Then again, if we return to Liz Truss, one of our comments she made, appealing to the Tory right wing, to the Tory shires, that she was saying she's horrified when she sees big, large solar farms, and instead she'd rather see the fields growing crops. Well, again, that is incoherent policy. I mean, solar is one of the cheapest forms of energy, so it's a good thing. But also, because of the Tory immigration policy, you could put crops in these fields and you wouldn't have any to pick the crops, so the crops will be left rotten. So it just shows, you can throw out sound bites that appeal to the right, but when you break it down, it's actually incoherent sound bites that they make no sense. But just one other thing, when you look at long-term strategic failure, clearly the UK benefited for a long time from North Sea oil and gas, so benefit for the revenues. We didn't create an oil and gas fund that we long asked for, so we didn't have this fund that was there for times of emergency right now. But also it was almost like thinking cheap gas would always be there, and that's why so many of our homes in the UK are reliant on methane gas to heat our homes, and that's why that's another reason the UK is so exposed to these increases in prices, because basically we rely on 80% of our homes rely on methane gas to heat our homes. There's not been enough long-term planning to move away from gas, and as part of our transition to net zero, there's not a proper strategy in place to decarbonise our homes.
Yes, so Scotland obviously has a well-publicised plan to what's called the just transition away from North Sea gas, but it looks like that's certainly not going to be a priority, if it's even a policy at all, of a new Truss government. But just finally, before we move on, Alan, can the Scottish Government do more? We reported that during the week the First Minister held an energy summit with players in the market, poverty campaigners, and basically the best he could do is come up with advice, since he contact your supplier if you've got serious problems with paying your bills. But can the Scottish Government do any more with its existing powers?
Well, as we know, and it's widely reported, and I think it's getting better understood. I mean, Scotland's effectively got a fixed budget, can't borrow for revenue spending, so there's so limited room for manoeuvre. Obviously, the Scottish Government has said they're going to have an emergency budget, and they're looking at where they can squeeze extra money out. But the reality is, if you're squeezing money out, you're making policy decisions, and you might be moving money from other areas in order to release further spending. I mean, also you look at what the Scottish Government's done with their fixed budget. We've got the Scottish Hill payment to £20 a week. That's going to increase to £25 a week within this year, and extend to all under 16s. So that's money, vital money, that's supporting families. But unfortunately, because of the Tory policies, families aren't getting the benefit of that they otherwise would. Also, the Scottish Government's got increase in what was previously called the cold weather payments. It's now low income assistance, so they're doubling that from £25 to £50 a year. We've got child assistance, so there's actually additional money given to families with children of disability to help them with their heating. Again, that all's now getting dwarfed with the scale of the problem that we're facing. And, it's certainly been refreshing to hear commentators in the general media now saying that the only government that's got the powers to be able to do something about this crisis is the Westminster government. And I think it's good that that's finally getting understood, that the Scottish government with very limited borrowing powers can't, as I say, borrow for revenue spending. Really, the blame at this lies at the door of Westminster, and it's for Westminster to come up with the solutions as well.
So generally, energy strategy and the shape of the energy market is entirely the responsibility of politicians in Westminster. There's not much under existing powers that the Scottish Government can do about that. Gentlemen, we're going to move on to our third story today. We're going to briefly look again at last week's announcement of the GERS figures. GERS stands for the General Expenditure and Revenue, I think. In other words, it's a statistic that shows how much money was raised in Scotland, we think, through various taxation, and also a measure of how much money was spent, we think, in Scotland. Now, prepositions are important here, Ian. The money spent, the negative side of the GERS figures, it's not money spent in Scotland, is it? It's money spent on behalf of Scotland. That's not the same thing, is it? Do you think the GERS figures show that Scotland has a deficit?
I have to admit, I haven't studied the figures that closely. But according to the Fraser and Alan Institute, there was a net fiscal balance in 2021-22 of 23.7 billion, which represents 12.3% of gross domestic product. This is promising in some ways. It's a huge fall from the 2020-21 figure of 22.7% of GDP. I think that's what the Fraser and Alan Institute is saying. But no, overall, I think that the figures can be quite misleading. I think the figures were originally designed by Ian Lang, as Secretary of State for Scotland, to basically make it look as if Scotland couldn't afford to be independent. And one has to question the methodology with which the figures are compiled. Richard Murphy, who's a London-based economist who I actually know, has done a lot of work on questioning that methodology. But there again, if the methodology is flawed, why does the Scottish National Party government go along with it? Why does it accept a flawed methodology? So it seems to be an area which is beset with difficulty and with misleading spin on either side of the argument.
Yes, it's difficult, isn't it, Alan, really to know what is raised and what is spent in a country. And one of the issues of the Scottish Government when we're talking about things like GERS is that we don't really have the data. There is a Scottish economist. The Scottish Government's economist is Dr. Alan Gillespie, I think, and he's been releasing what they sometimes call experimental figures. Is the Scottish Government at the early stages of setting up the kind of data? And so do we not really know what the GERS figures are saying? They're the best we can do, but we haven't really got enough data to answer the question, is Scotland viable or is it not? Can we tell?
Yeah, I mean, as Ian says, there's arguments on both sides of the debate about what the GERS figures really mean. I mean, the reality is it shows a kind of position that Scotland's in, but Scotland as part of the UK. Now, if you actually also, when you look into some of the figures, there's nearly £5 billion of technically spend allocated to Scotland, which is Scotland's share of UK debt. So that's debt that the UK government have built up over the years, and obviously it gets allocated to Scotland at a population share. When it comes to MOD spending, then again, that's just a percentage pro rata. So you start to look at the reserve spend. As you alluded to, it's not actually spend in Scotland, it's just Scotland's hypothetical percentage share. So if you're an independent country, you're actually making decisions on that spending to suit the country. In many ways, you'd actually then be spending that money in Scotland, which would actually have a benefit in Scotland as well. So it is just a theoretical position of Scotland as we are as part of the UK. It certainly doesn't actually show what an independent Scotland would be like. And it's up to us actually going forward to present the economic argument for Scotland and demonstrating how Scotland can be fiscally stable as an independent country and show the economic benefits that independence would bring.
Yes, the GERS figures, as you said, Ian, various people have criticised them because of, as I said a minute ago, lack of data, really, and also this idea that money is attributed to Scotland, which Scotland didn't actually spend, but you get a chunk of the bill anyway, even if you didn't order the item. The thing that strikes me about the GERS figures is I never heard about them until about 5 or 6 years ago. Once they started going negative, suddenly they became a figure that everyone talks about. But before that, apparently, they were positive for Scotland for a few years, and then it wasn't an issue. So how do these things become newsworthy? Why was it not newsworthy if it showed Scotland in a positive balance, but it only becomes a story once it seems to be negative?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I remember I first looked at these figures in about 2000 when I was financial editor of the Sunday Herald. So I was looking at them, but they were very much less at that time. And you're right, it is surprising, when the figures were showing a massive surplus for Scotland, why wasn't that the headline on the front page of the Daily Mail? I guess it's just not a story which is particularly in their interest because, they're strongly opposed to Scottish independence. So they don't want to highlight anything which makes it seem potentially more viable. And I think, overall, the press is generally, I can't remember the exact number, but I think there are 14 daily and Sunday papers published in Scotland, national ones. And I think only one of those, which is the National, supports the idea of Scottish independence. So, yeah, you've got 14, which are probably quite keen to bury those on page 300, on page 55, and one which, if it had been in existence, would probably splashed it on the front.
Yeah, you referred earlier on to Professor Richard Murphy. Yeah, I follow his blog, and I think it's called Tax Justice, if anyone wants to see his arguments on that and on many other topics. He does have something to say every day, a very active writer and blogger. But one of the things that arises, and he suggests, is that the GERS figures show what's happening now, but if Scotland were an independent country, it would do something different, wouldn't it? So looking towards the future, Alan, do you think that Scotland would have a different tax regime? I mean, there's a possibility if Scotland were an independent country, lots of companies would just relocate and pay their taxes somewhere else, especially if that somewhere else was cheaper. Would Scotland actually look at tax again and say, what is the tax base? What are we going to tax? Would we tax land, for example, or tax pollution, as the Green Party would like to do? So would we do something different so that those figures would be irrelevant anyway?
Yeah, I mean, it would be up to the government of the day, and that's the one thing. When you're independent, people are voting in the government of their choice. It's not like Westminster where we're getting a government that we consistently vote against. So some of the tax decisions would be for that government of the day, but there's no doubt things would be different. For a start, you would hope you'd have a much fairer and more equitable tax system. You could reform even your income tax. How what the bandings are, what the thresholds are, make that fairer. I'm amenable to a land tax. That would be for the government of the day. But the key thing is you need to look at what spending decisions you want to make, how you want to support people, how you want to have a fairer and more equitable society. And to do that, what do you need to raise to do that, and how do you do that in a fair way? And that should be part of a positive debate as we go forward and debate the merits of an independent Scotland.
And just before we move on to the next topic, on the question of what could Scotland do if it had the choices, if it had the sovereign powers of the government. The other day when I was talking to Roger Mullen, who set up a research group called The Bottom Line with a couple of economists, and they have been publishing papers on what Scotland could do. And in fact, the papers they published last week were suggesting that Scotland pays the price for being attached to a declining UK, because in fact UK's economy is in relative decline, in fact possibly in the next 6 months it will go to absolute decline as well. So if you want to know more about the bottom lines arguments, please look at them. You can find our broadcast from, I think it was last Friday, and also from thebottomline.scot. That's where that can be found. So I'm going to move on to a final story. We're going to talk about the media. So I think we'll first of all go to Ian. So you mentioned the other day that one of the Scottish papers at least supports independence. Now remember, during the 2014 referendum on independence, the Sunday Herald came out, I think, just a few weeks before, or maybe months before, maybe you can remind me, and declared for independence. And I think they were the only one at the time. Is that right? Since then, The National was launched, as I recall. The National didn't exist, did it, at the time of the 2014 referendum?
No.
It was published afterwards, wasn't it?
The Sunday Herald had never really been taken sides on the constitutional divide, although I think it did have a lot of broadly pro-independence writers, including Leslie Riddoch and Ian McWhirter at the time. But I think then it changed in just ahead of the September 2014 referendum with Richard Walker as editor, and did come out strongly in favour of independence, and even commissioned an artwork from Alistair Gray for the front page, which was quite dramatic, quite impressive. But after that, I think there was a lot of ructions, and I can't remember the exact details, but there were some issues regarding strong pro-independence supporters happy with the way a rally had been covered, and refused to illustrate that pro-rally. And in the end, they basically decided to split Sunday Herald in two papers, one of which was the Herald on Sunday, which as far as I'm aware is broadly pro-union, and a separate paper called the Sunday National, which was broadly in favour of independence. But the National had already come into being at that point as a pro-independence title. It's quite interesting that these are all products of a company called NewsQuest, which is a global media company based in Virginia, I think, and they don't mind owning a paper which supports Scottish independence, which I think is quite interesting in itself. Sorry, your overall question.
Well, I'm just wondering why, when about 50% of the Scottish voters are for independence, roughly speaking, it's 50-50. So as you said earlier on,
yes.
the people who support the union have about 14 newspapers, and the 50% who support independence have one. So why can't other news operators make the marketing decision that NewsQuest has? The National has that market to itself? Isn't that nuts marketing? There's a job there for people to sell to the 50% who support independence.
Yes, because there is some criticism of the National, and I don't think some of it is maybe merited, but generally I think it does a reasonably good job within its framework. But I mean, basically, I think you have some non-dom billionaire media owners, such as Lord Rothermere, who owns the Daily Mail, who basically probably themselves are strongly pro-union, so they don't want their paper to be pro-independence. I think you've got Reach PLC, which owns the Record and the Express and the Daily Mirror, and I think they're checked by the Record, very pro-Labour and therefore pro-union. I could go through every group, but overall, I think that the trouble is they're owned by either large PLCs based in London, or by very wealthy individuals who aren't even resident in the UK, and they generally don't want to support. They don't want any to publish any paper which supports independence, and it is ridiculous. Yeah, if it's a roughly 48-52 split or 50-50 split, it's strange that more than 95% of the papers are pro-union. It means people aren't getting a very accurate reflection on what's really going on in Scotland. I think some papers are more.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, papers are more independent. I think some of the DC Thomson ones, actually, including the Sunday Post, are, they're not pro-independence, but they're more open to looking at ideas which the Daily Mail wouldn't even consider.
Yes, of course. I was just about to say there that obviously newspapers in general are having a hard time. Anyway, they have to go online. Very few people are reading solid papers, physical papers. Let's move on to the broadcast media, though, because it's been widely reported that Emily Maitlis, formerly the anchor at a Newsnight, said during the Edinburgh Festival last week that the BBC is basically under control of the Conservative Party. She's talking, I think, particularly about Sir Robbie Gibb. If you meet Robbie Gibb, remember he's a Sir. Call him Sir. Now, Robbie Gibb used to be an advisor to Theresa May, and he was also appointed by Boris Johnson, and he was involved in the setting up of GB News, the right-wing news channel, and this person is actually on the board of the BBC giving him advice. And so Emily Maitlis, who's now ex-BBC, of course, did say during the week, this is a clear Conservative Party influence right at the top of the BBC. So Ian Brown, what does this say about honest broadcasting and fair and unbalanced reporting?
So was that Tina or was that to myself?
Yes, Alan, please.
No, I mean, it's good that Emily's highlighting this. I mean, we've known for a while that the Tories are appointing stooges to many different bodies, and it's kind of ironic that the Tories actually still, completely mistrust the BBC. Obviously, they're trying to undermine the BBC at every turn. We know they're trying to privatise Channel 4, and that's because Channel 4 has the temerity to report fairly and to challenge the Conservative government. But it is a real concern because clearly fair media broadcasting should underpin a democracy. Now, we've obviously, in the independent side, we've long had concerns about, how some of the views of independence has been reported. So it's refreshing to have that debate, but the power of the Conservatives is a real concern, and it does raise concerns for what should be a functioning democracy.
Yes, Ian, one of the the arguments used for having Sir Robbie Gibb advising the BBC is because the government wants to make sure that the BBC is pursuing its remit of honest reporting. Is that the best way to do it?
No, I think Robbie Gibb is the wrong person to have on the board of the BBC. He should never have been appointed. He's basically a self-confessed messianic Brexiteer. He's a messiah, believes in so strongly. He's a messiah for Brexit. He was BBC editor of live political programs for quite a long time before he did these other things. So that makes you wonder, if his own mindset was pro-hard Brexit and hard right, why was the BBC even allowing him to edit its live political programs for as long as it did? I think powers of a director are actually overrated. The non-exec director normally should not be able to meddle in day-to-day output, or the appointment of Jess Brammer or whatever else, or details of what Emily made on Newsnight. It's just wrong. It's wrong that he was ever appointed a non-exec director, and we know that it was Boris Johnson who appointed him to that role. But I think the problems with the BBC actually are far longer standing than anything to do with Robbie Gibb or Emily Maitlis. I think they go way back, well, probably before 2004. But in 2004, you had the Hutton inquiry, which basically resulted in both the Director General and the Chairman having to quit. And Andrew Marr, who I have met, said that, and I think certain other senior BBC figures who I've spoken to have told me that there was a collective loss of nerve at the BBC from that moment on. And I think that's been playing out for the past 16 or so years, with the BBC basically terrified of losing its status as a license fee paid broadcaster, and with its royal charter, and so terrified of losing that they'll basically kowtow to the government of the day, in this case the Tories. And it's tragic, because the BBC used to be a highly respected, independent, authoritative voice in global and UK affairs. And I think to some extent it's lost that over the past decade or so.
Well, I'm afraid we'll have to just wind it up there just now. But clearly, Ian, you've raised a lot of questions about what is the role of journalism and what is the role of a state broadcaster. And indeed, Ian, I wonder, and Alan, I wonder what would the Scottish Government's decision be on independence? How would these important questions be handled in an independent Scotland? So perhaps we'll have a special on that one day. That raises a lot of issues that I'm afraid we don't have any more time to discuss this afternoon. So can I thank Ian Fraser, author and journalist and blogger, for joining us from Midlothian, and Alan Brown for joining us from Ayrshire, from just outside Kilmarnock. So thank you, gentlemen. It was good to speak to both of you. So that's about it for today for the Full Scottish. So can I remind you that we are entirely supported by the people who have looked at our website and who have, and as we urge you to, who have signed up for £5 a month. That'll do, and that makes you one of our supporters. We're trying to grow the number of supporters, and as we do, we'll try and grow the number of programmes we can put out. So that's it for the Full Scottish today. So we're back with the Scotland at 7 Monday to Friday. So I hope you'll tune in then. Thanks for watching now. Bye.